I remembered the smell of the apartment in the mornings, stale coffee from the night before, the lavender dish soap, her grapefruit shampoo drying in the bathroom air. She always woke up before me, not because she was a morning person, but because she enjoyed the quiet half hour when the city still rubbed sleep from its eyes. I would hear the kettle click and her bare feet on the parquet. She hummed when she measured grounds, a habit she denied and laughed about when I teased her. The week before it happened, our living room looked like a craft store had exploded. Ribbons, ivory envelopes, a seating chart that changed every time someone remembered a cousin. She sat cross-legged on the floor with a marker in her mouth and a concentration that made her forehead crease. "Your Aunt Eva can't sit near my Aunt Nina," she mumbled around the marker. "Two queens is one too many." She wore my hoodie and mismatched socks, and every now and then she glanced at me with the look that had sold me on a lifetime. Like I was both obvious and miraculous. We had a dozen rituals like that. She wiped her hands on my t-shirts when she cooked. I always left the window cracked even in winter because fresh air, she claimed, made us kinder. She once wrote a grocery list that just said bananas, patience, basil. I kept it on the fridge. If a stranger had walked into our life that month, they would have seen ordinary love with a deadline, all those tiny decisions that felt like promises. An aisle song. The shape of a cake. The color of napkins no one would remember. At night we lay on our backs and imagined a dog, a bigger apartment, a trip somewhere cheap after the wedding because we couldn't afford the place with the glass water. We said things like "when we're 80" and meant them. Small things began to shift the way wood swells in rain. You know it's happening, and you can almost pretend it's natural. She started taking her phone with her to the shower. She had always been careless with it. Leaving it face up on the table, the lock screen a churn of messages from her sister, questionable memes from friends. Suddenly she carried it like a secret. When I asked, she shrugged. Work. Kara's being dramatic again. Kara was her manager. We didn't like her. That made it easy to nod and let the subject die. Another night, I found a receipt in the pocket of the coat I'd loaned her. A bar near her office I didn't recognize, timestamped just after midnight, 2 drinks. It wasn't proof of anything. I folded it and put it back in the pocket as if I hadn't seen it. I told myself all the reasonable things you tell yourself when you want reason to win. She began sleeping on the couch sometimes, claiming she'd fallen asleep watching a show. I believed her the first 2 times. The third time, I woke to the sound of the window latch and the whisper of curtains. She was standing there in the blue corridor of streetlight, her phone lighting her face from below, making her look like a portrait with the wrong century. "What are you doing?" I asked, not unkindly. She tilted the screen toward me, quick, a flash of a to-do list that could have belonged to anyone. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Sorry I woke you." Nothing in her voice was sharp. Nothing in mine was either. But in the quiet that followed, something old inside me sat up and listened. We had our last tasting the Tuesday before. She mostly moved food around her plate and smiled in the wrong places. In the car, she turned the radio up too loud. It took me until the bridge to turn it down. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "Yes," she said too quickly. She rested her head on the window, hair blown across her face. "I'm just tired." That night she fell asleep with her back to me, the curve of her shoulder a sign I couldn't read. I put my hand near her elbow and let it hover there, not touching, and felt stupid, like a tourist trying to speak a language he used to know. On Wednesday, I watched her iron a shirt that didn't need ironing. She smoothed the same line 4 times without moving the shirt. "You'll be late," I said, and she jumped like I had shouted. She kissed my cheek and left a crescent of heat there that lasted an entire minute after the door closed. I waited with my hand on the cheek until it cooled, as if I could press the moment back into the day and flatten it into something comprehensible. On Thursday, she died. It was a taxi and a truck and a yellow light that should have been red. There was no theater to it. No last words, no meaningful hand squeeze, no miracle survivor story. I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A policeman's voice did that gentle thing they train you to do when you are about to rearrange a life. I didn't sit down until the silence after he finished, then I sat on the kitchen floor where her hair tie had rolled under the chair that morning, and I picked it up and hurt myself with it. The days after were gray and fluorescent. People brought soup, flowers, and their own faces. Careful and wet. Her mother held onto the sleeve of my jacket as if that could prevent the next catastrophe. Her father tried to keep lists of tasks on legal pads and ended up writing her name in the margins like he had to anchor himself there. Someone needed to call the venue and the florist and the DJ. Someone needed to tell her dressmaker not to finish the hem. Our apartment grew smaller and louder with boxes and voices. At night, I lay in our bed and faced her side as if the outline of her there might be as reliable as a constellation. I went to the bathroom and stared at her toothbrush like it might tell me what to do. I smelled everything she had touched. I turned the window latch because she always hated stale air, and I cried when the night came in and didn't bring her with it. On the 7th day after, I wrote an email to the photographer telling her to cancel and charge me whatever she needed, and then I stared at the blinking cursor for a long time, as if the screen might change its mind. The letter arrived the day after that. It was a paper letter, not an email, thick ivory stock like the invitations we had ordered. My name was on the envelope in her round, decisive handwriting. The postmark held a date that hadn't happened yet, the day we were supposed to get married. I held it without opening it for a full minute, letting the weight tell me nothing. The stamp sat at an angle the way she always stuck stamps, as if they were rebellious. When I slid the paper out, it smelled faintly of her perfume. My eyes made it to the second line before my heart started moving in a way that felt like falling. By the time you read this, she had written, "I will be married to you, or I won't." I needed a letter either way because I have been a coward in all the ways that matter and a brave person in all the ways that don't. She had used a service that mails letters on a future date. She had told me about it once when she was drunk and sentimental, how she had written to her future self at 18 promising she wouldn't cut bangs. Accountability, she joked. This letter was her accountability to me. She wrote about a man from her office who was not really a man of her office, not in the official sense. He freelanced sometimes and flirted like he deserved extra oxygen. It started, she said, with conversations where she said too much about me in exchange for a look that made her feel new. It was winter and she had been fighting with me about nothing, which is what people call it when they are afraid to name the real thing. For 2 months, she met him for coffee, nothing more, and lied to me about minor errands that sounded reasonable. I didn't love him, she wrote. That is the part that makes this both worse and better. He was a place where I put my fear. In the letter, she didn't confess to a physical affair. She confessed to a moral one. She confessed to liking the person she got to be in the bar with the soft lighting and the tall bottles and no history. She confessed to having promised to stop seeing him and then seeing him again. Then she stopped, she wrote. She blocked him the day after we bought the rings. Then she unblocked him once. Then she blocked him again and changed her number. I have been trying to be clean and I have not been clean. I am cleaner than I was. She had scheduled the letter for our wedding day as a kind of ritual, to tell me the truth with the ring already on her hand, to let me decide what to do after the party and the photos. If you are reading this as my husband, she wrote, know that I chose you in the only way that matters, I chose to stop. If you are reading this because I couldn't do it, know that I couldn't bear the shame and that is not your fault. She didn't mention dying. She could not have. She wrote about the napkins and the dog we wanted and the ugly lamp her aunt was giving us that she promised to hide behind a plant. She wrote that I deserved a person who didn't need to rehearse courage. There were details in the letter that matched what had bothered me, the bar receipt, the late-night texts, the too loud radio. She named the bar and the dates like pins on a map. She gave me the password to an email she had made to write to him and then to herself after she stopped, the notes of someone trying to explain her own brain. She told me to read if I wanted to, or to burn it if I wanted to, and that either choice would be an act of love. I read the letter twice and then put it face down on the table as if I might accidentally read it again. My anger arrived late, like a guest who had been circling the block looking for parking. It didn't roar. It sat heavy and gray in my ribs and made breathing an act one had to supervise. People had told me grief made you forget to eat. They hadn't told me grief made the air get complicated. I walked to the sink and washed my hands, not because they were dirty, but because I needed a task that rinsed something. The next morning, I decided to collect proof of what I now knew. Not for revenge. For accuracy, so that I could put the day back in order. I made coffee and opened her laptop with the practiced movement of someone who had been allowed there for years. I logged into the email she had given me in the letter. It was all there. The first message with the subject, "You're funny." Coffee? The line where she had written, "My boyfriend is a good man," as if goodness were an obstacle and not the floor. The last message where she said, "I'm getting married. Please stop." Then a brief relapse and a last halt, nothing since. I printed nothing. I wrote nothing down. It felt wrong to make copies of a pain that already had too many. I logged out and closed the laptop and pressed my palm on it until I could feel the heat through the metal. I went to the bar named in the receipts, at noon when no one romantic would be there. The bartender remembered her. He remembered the other man too and rolled his eyes like all men who work in places built for time to dissolve. "He thinks he's special," he said, polishing a glass that was already clean. "She wasn't like the others." "She was like herself," I said, surprising both of us. He nodded. I found the man's social media. It was full of the kind of photos people take when they are afraid of being ordinary. Sunset selfies, gym mirrors, inspirational quotes with grammar injuries. I wrote his name on a sticky note and then threw it away. That was not the list I wanted to keep. I told her parents about the letter because I had promised her in her absence to be transparent. Her mother cried into a dish towel and stroked the fabric as if it might translate my words into something gentler. Her father listened like a man counting, eyes flicking to an imaginary ledger. "People are complicated," he said finally. A sentence that felt inadequate and generous at the same time. "She loved you." "I know," I said, and I did. Love had not been the problem. Love rarely is. Fear had been. Shame had been. The human need to stand at a cliff and look down. At home, I took apart the wedding. I called the venue and the florist and the DJ and was surprised by the profession of their sympathy and their efficiency with penalties. I unpacked a box of favors we had tied with a jute string and untied each bow like undoing a spell. I stacked the programs we had designed that said both our names next to each other and made a neat pile that looked like a mistake in a factory. I kept the dress bag where she had hung it on the bedroom door and put my hand on the fabric as I passed, like a blessing or a farewell. I called her sister and asked if she wanted to take it. "Not yet," she said. "I need to breathe for a while first." We all did. In the evenings, I began to walk the same loop around our block we had walked together. I noticed things we never notice when we are in love. The chipped paint on the green mailbox, the dog in the corner window who never barked, the woman in the red coat who read on her stoop every afternoon and looked up only when a car honked in a tone that suggested menace rather than inconvenience. I let the city tell me where I was again. It took its time. The man wrote to me exactly once. He must have heard somehow or guessed my existence and certainly my email. "I'm sorry for your loss," he wrote, and then nothing else, like a man who had borrowed a sentence he felt obligated to return. I typed a paragraph and deleted it. I typed a single sentence and deleted it too. Finally, I wrote, "There's nothing here for you," and pressed send. It was less dramatic than I thought it would be. Mostly it was air leaving a balloon. I boxed up the letter after a week and put it in the top drawer of my desk under tax papers and warranties for appliances that do not break. I didn't burn it. I didn't reread it every night. I let it be a thing that existed, like the scar on my knee from a bike when I was 8. On what would have been our wedding day, I dressed in the suit I had planned to wear and went for a walk in the quiet morning. The world did not notice my costume, which felt like mercy. I went to the bridge we always crossed and leaned on the cold rail and watched the water move like it had better places to be. One of the ribbons from our craft store explosion had gotten tangled in the ironwork, trailing blue into gray. I untied it carefully and put it in my pocket. Friends wanted to gather, to make toasts that turned into sobs, to tell stories that did that thing memory does where it improves the furniture. I let them come later, and we ate the catering I could not return. We drank the wine we had ordered in a quantity that now felt vulgar. We looked at the photos pinned in a line that made a life look curated. I laughed more than I thought I would. I cried less. After everyone left, I took the garbage out twice because I needed to take something out of the house that was heavy. In the weeks after, I went back to work. I accepted the way people in the hallway paused before speaking, as if words were heavy and fragile at once. My desk plant died, as if to say the quiet part out loud. I replaced it with a plant I knew the name of, a snake plant, impossible to kill. I watered it too much at first and then learned to trust its stubbornness. I started therapy on a Tuesday because that is how long the list had been. I told the therapist about the letter in the first session and watched her almost smile, not because it was funny, but because life is sometimes too neat in the wrong way. We talked about grief and betrayal and how my brain wanted to braid them together into a rope I could swing on when the floor felt unhelpful. She told me to separate them. I did. On paper, I wrote she died and she lied as different sentences. It felt like arithmetic. It helped. One afternoon, I took apart the corner of the living room where our wedding had lived before it died. I found the list with bananas, patience, basil scribbled in her handwriting and stuck it back on the fridge where it had been all along, then moved it to the inside of a cabinet because seeing it by accident felt like a bruise you bump again and again. I kept the plant holds we'd bought for table numbers because they were useful in a way grief rarely is. I called the service that had mailed the letter and asked if there were others. The woman on the phone sounded like a person who had learned how to be gentle by practicing. Just the one, she said. She scheduled it 6 months ago. She changed the wording a few times. She never changed the date. Thank you, I said, which felt insufficient and also exactly correct. I sent a short email to our DJ to apologize for the late cancellation and he replied with a song suggestion that made no sense but somehow worked, an instrumental piano piece that sounded like walking across a room you had forgotten you loved. I played it while I cleaned and stopped once to lean on a doorframe and breathe. Her mother came to my apartment 2 months later with a cardboard box full of things no one knew what to do with, a cake topper shaped like nothing in particular, our RSVP board with check marks that looked like tiny victories, a book of vows we were supposed to fill in but never did. She put the box down gently and looked around the room as if measuring something. She would have been so happy here, she said. It came out not as a judgment but as a weather report. We were happy, I said. Both true and not anymore. We sat at the table and I told her about the letter in more detail than I had managed before. She closed her eyes like a person lowering her face into sun and nodded and didn't try to rescue either of us with platitudes. She tried, her mother said. Sometimes that is the bravest and worst thing a person can do at once. When she left, she hugged me with the firmness of a person who has been practicing letting go and still hates it. I stood in the doorway and watched her walk down the stairs as if the distance might change its mind. I did small practical things that felt like building. I changed the sheets, bought a new mug, fixed the cabinet hinge that had squeaked the entire time we lived there and somehow never bothered us. I deleted the playlist called Processional Options and made one called Morning. It was mostly quiet songs you could breathe with. I did one theatrical thing. I wrote a letter of my own to her, not scheduled for a future date, not mailed anywhere. I wrote in ordinary pen on ordinary paper and told her what the days felt like now. Which was less like a cliff and more like uneven ground. I told her that I had read everything she wanted me to read and that I had chosen to keep both truths, the good one and the hard one. I told her I forgave her and also I didn't, which is what forgiveness actually is when you are honest. I put the letter in the same drawer as hers and did not put a label on the drawer because I am a person who can find things without labels. The man's name stopped crossing my mind except as a shape that sometimes passed behind a curtain. On the rare days it sharpened, I let it pass. He belonged to the version of the story where I am small. I was trying to live in the one where I am not. I wanted a clean lesson and didn't get one. The moral refused to stand still long enough to be stitched on a pillow. Some days it sounded like trust is not a guarantee, it is a daily practice. Some days it sounded like there are no heroic betrayals, only small cowardices that add up, and sometimes you can walk them back. Most days it sounded like breathe. Then do the next thing. I learned to make coffee the way she did, finally getting the water temperature right so it bloomed and didn't burn. I wanted to be angry about the fact that she taught me something after she left, but instead I did the immature thing and pretended I had always known how. Then once, to the empty air, I said, "You win," and felt better. The letter never became less strange. Time doesn't turn artifice into natural law. Still, it slowly lost its sharpest edges. It became not an object that could hurt me but a document of someone trying to be more honest than she had been taught to be. When I thought of it, I thought of her sitting at our table with her back to the window, writing and rewriting, making sentences do push-ups. I thought of her choosing the stamp, putting it at a tilt, making a bet on a future she hoped for and feared. I thought of myself in that future opening the envelope and learning something I would have rather learned in person. Months later, I ran into the bartender again in daylight at a grocery store, which felt like spotting a teacher outside school. He recognized me without surprise. "You okay?" he asked, and the audacity of the question felt almost like kindness. "I'm getting there," I said. He nodded like I had given a correct answer to a complicated problem. We stood between the produce and the cereal, and for a second the world felt like it was allowing the ordinary to be holy. He held up a bunch of basil. "You cook?" he asked. I shook my head. "Start," he said. "It makes the apartment smell like you care." I bought basil and bananas. Patience was not on the shelf, but I added it mentally to the list. In the first spring without her, a friend invited me to the coast. I stood at the edge of the water and looked at the line where the sky admits defeat. I thought about vows that were never said and promises that lived in my bones anyway. I thought about how she had been two things at once, a person who loved me honestly and a person who lied to me partially. I thought about how most of us are exactly two things at once and how love is saying yes to both and still believing in yourself when one of the things wins around. I went home and moved the ribbon from my desk drawer to a jar on a shelf. It looked silly there, too big and too blue. It also looked like a piece of a story that had belonged to me and still did, even if the ending had changed. Sometimes at night the window would rattle the way it used to when she left it open for air, and I would picture her in the doorway, phone light on her face, thinking the private thoughts that make us unknowable. I didn't speak to her then. I didn't turn the memory into a conversation. I just let the image be a true thing that had happened, and then I went to sleep. The quiet victory is not that I found a way to forget, or to pretend the letter was a trick of timing that didn't matter. The victory was smaller and more sustainable. I learned to stand in the middle of the story without choosing a side against myself. I learned to let love be a complicated teacher. I learned that leaving, even when it is done by fate, doesn't erase what came before, and that telling the truth late is still better than never telling it. If there is a final sentence, it is this: I loved a woman who wrote me a letter from a future she didn't get to see, and I answered it in the only way that made sense to me. I kept living. I let the truth sit where it needed to. I opened the window. I made coffee. I bought basil. And every day I practice not needing the world to be simpler than it is.